So we are going to talk about public opinion today. So we're going to talk about what exactly public opinion is, how we form an opinion, and essentially what goes into trying to find out what we think, what we feel as a country. So public opinion is essentially our attitudes. How are we feeling about a particular issue, an event, a leader? How do we feel about Donald Trump, or Black Lives Matter, or the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg? So it's a way of trying to figure out where we are at any point on any particular issue. And of course, part of what forms public opinion is our values, right? Our basic principles. Do we consider ourselves to be open-minded, liberal, conservative, etc.? And our political ideology also ties in. What do we feel about the role of the government? Is it their role to intervene in the economy? Or do we think they need to stay out of it? How do we feel about the government regulating our private lives? So that's also going to tie into how we respond to a particular issue. And of course, our opinions can have an emotional connection. And there is a fairly reasonable measure of this. You can ask people how they feel. Does this candidate make you happy, sad, angry? What do you feel about what happened in the Breonna Taylor case? Yesterday, the grand jury issued one indictment against one officer for essentially reckless endangerment for shooting into the apartment next door. None of the officers were indicted for murder or any other related charges. So people are going to have strong feelings about that one way or the other. So you can ask people how they feel emotionally as well. So some of our political values are pretty reliably measured across ideology and so on. If you ask people, what are American values? What does it mean to be American? There's strong support for the idea of liberty, right? Individual freedoms, liberties, and the idea that the government shouldn't interfere into our private lives. In 2015, a survey found that 54% of Americans didn't agree with the government collecting our cell phone or internet history in the name of counterterrorism. We do also believe in the idea of equality of opportunity, that we should all be able to succeed personally and economically as far as we can. And broadly speaking, 86% of Americans do say, yeah, we should do whatever it takes to ensure that there is this equality of opportunity. Having good quality public education, allowing for people to go to college, develop technical skills, invent the next Facebook, things like that. Where we see the differences starting to form is how we ensure this equality of opportunity. How do we provide quality public education? How do we ensure that everybody can succeed? On the surface, there's a lot of agreement. When you start to drill down, that's where you see the disagreements happening. But overwhelmingly, 95% of Americans like that we can criticize the government, that we can say, you know what, Mr. President, I don't agree with you on this, or Senator Cornyn, I don't think should be reelected. That we have the right to criticize the government, to criticize policymakers. I'm not sure I want to meet that other 5%, but overwhelmingly, we do have some common ideas, some common values that, when asked, pretty universally we're going to agree with. So in terms of various political ideologies, this is broadly speaking. Obviously, there are exceptions, nuances, and so on. But broadly speaking, someone who identifies as liberal does support government intervention into the economy, does believe that businesses need to be regulated, need to be overseen by the government. They also believe in giving more money to things like Medicare, Medicaid, and welfare. They do tend to be pro-choice and do tend to support same-sex marriage and LGBT rights. So a couple of well-known liberals include Nancy Pelosi, the current Speaker of the House, Kamala Harris, the current VP candidate for the Democrats. Conservatives tend to oppose the government stepping into the economy, tend to believe that the economy works best when left alone. They also favor a smaller national government, tend to take the opinion that more power should be given to the states. They also usually oppose abortion, are usually pro-life, and usually oppose same-sex marriage. And again, this is very broadly speaking. Libertarians are kind of a mixed bag. They tend to be economically conservative, opposing government regulations, opposing government involvement in the economy. But they are usually a bit more socially liberal, do support legalizing marijuana, keeping abortion legal. They tend to take the attitude that the government needs to stay out of everybody's business, both economically and personally. That the government that governs least governs best. So Ron Paul is a pretty well-known libertarian in Congress. We've also seen the rise of individuals calling themselves social democrats. They tend to agree with the Democratic Party on the issues of free markets and private business. They will say, of course, you need to have private business. Of course, you have to have a free market economy. They also strongly believe that it is the role of government to ensure equality. That the government should put, for example, higher taxes on corporations to pay for universal health care or low-cost college, things like that. So Bernie Sanders is a pretty well-known social democrat. They're also sometimes referred to as progressives, although not all progressives fully identify as social democrats. So Democrats are pretty common throughout most of Europe. The governments in countries like Denmark, Finland, Sweden are usually run by social democrats. They're not as common here, although we are starting to see some movement towards identifying in that particular way. And for a lot of people, they can sometimes be a mix of ideologies. You might be economic conservative but socially liberal, or socially conservative but economically liberal. Most people, unless they're staunchly tied to a party, aren't going to say they're completely liberal or completely conservative. They're going to be somewhere in between. Okay, so how do we decide what we are? How do we decide if we're liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican? We go through a process known as political socialization. And this is where our underlying beliefs and values about the government get formed. When we start to decide, how do we feel about abortion, government regulations, healthcare, the economy? And there's a variety of factors that play a role in us determining what we believe. One of the biggest agents, of course, is your family. Also, the social networks you belong to. Your school system, the church you belong to. All of those can play a role. If you're someone who goes to church on a regular basis, you're going to be a bit influenced by the teachings of the church. There's also major life-changing events that can have an impact. September 11th, right after September 11th, support for the government went through the roof. Huge levels of support for the government, huge support for law enforcement and the military, high levels of patriotism. And of course, that's not sustainable. Eventually, the levels had to come back down. But for a lot of people, the shock of what happened did kind of have to reshape how they viewed the world, how they felt about what was happening. And there's also a psychological factor. If you're someone who's more anxious, concerned about the state of the world, you're more likely to want the system to stay as it is. You don't want to see major changes, chaos, upheaval. So you're going to want high levels of spending for law enforcement, the military, government entities. If you're someone who's a little less anxious, you're probably going to be okay with changes. You're going to be okay with the reality that eventually everything does change. Okay with what could be considered radical changes to society. And I asked this in my last class and I regretted it, but out of curiosity, show of hands, how many of you are actually, or are old enough to actually remember 9/11 when it happened? Okay, so a couple of us, yeah. I mean, for most of my students, they were very young, so for you it's more like a history lesson than an actual like memory of what happened that day, which is inevitable, right? My parents can remember when Kennedy was assassinated, but for people my age, it's history, right? We don't have that same tie to it. So one of the biggest factors of socialization is, of course, your family. We do tend to absorb our parents' political beliefs. And research has shown that if you're raised in a house where your parents are Democrat, you're more likely to become a Democrat. If they're Republican, you're more likely to become a Republican. And this happens even when they don't necessarily intend to impart certain beliefs on us. So if you hear your parents saying something like, all these homeless people, they're a real drag, we should just kick them out of the city, that's going to have a little bit of an impact on your belief system. So when you're first learning, you do tend to reflect your parents' beliefs. Your first election, you might vote the same way your parents do. There's also the role of your social network. You may find that you face a lot of peer pressure to conform to your friends' beliefs or your church's beliefs or your family friends. And sometimes this conformity will happen if it's supposed to be highly visible. So for example, if you belong to a church that says abortion is murder, it's a sin, even if you disagree with that, outwardly you might conform to that and say you agree because You don't want to rock the boat. You don't want to risk becoming an outcast. And there is also the role of education. Research has found that tolerance for racial minorities increases amongst people who go to college. You're exposed to different ideas, different beliefs, different people. You're going to form different opinions. If you grew up in a mostly white community and then you go to a college with a diverse population, your attitudes towards certain religions, ethnicities, and races is likely to change. And this is sometimes where we see children breaking away from their parents' political views. You grow up in a very conservative household, and then you go to college and you think, I don't necessarily agree with this. This might be where you start to see people kind of pulling away from that first sense of identity, and then making Thanksgiving dinner very fun that year. But mostly, forming your own identities. There's also differences based on things like race, ethnicity, gender, and religion. When surveyed, about 90% of African Americans will say that they believe that African Americans and other minorities aren't treated equally under the law. Part of this is because there is a perception that they are a member of a group with a shared history and a common identity, that they faced discrimination in the past. So there tends to be a little bit more solidarity within the group. 54% of whites, when surveyed, agreed that it's not equal treatment under the law. That percentage gone up, mostly because of increasing awareness of issues around policies like stop and frisk, police brutality, and so on. So we are seeing that attitude shifting a little bit. In terms of ethnicity, Latinos make up 9% of the electorate. Both parties go heavily after the Latino vote. Statistically speaking, Latinos tend to lean Democrat because of the Democratic Party's stance on immigration. 64% of Latinos support finding a way to give all immigrants legal status, including, of course, undocumented immigrants. But only 42% of whites think that that should be the case. So we do tend to see Latinos leaning Democrat, but both parties go after them very heavily in the election year. Gender-wise, there is a gender gap in elections. Women tend to vote Democrat higher levels compared to men. Obviously, this isn't across the board, but there was a pretty significant gender gap in the 2016 election. And part of it is because women are looking at issues like healthcare, childcare, education, and welfare. Men are more concerned generally with issues like law enforcement, gun control, or no gun rules, military intervention. So depending on what issue women and men think is the most important in an election, they can differ very widely how they approach a particular candidate. And there is the role of religion. Evangelical Christians do tend to be a bit more conservative. For example, on the issue of abortion, about 31.5% of evangelicals think abortion should always be legal. It's 56% of Catholics, which has increased in recent years, and 75% of people who are non-religious. So someone who might be atheist, agnostic, spiritual, but not religious. On the issue of same-sex marriage, 35% of evangelicals support it, 60% of Catholics, which again has gone up, 76% of the non-religious. Keeping in mind that issues like abortion and same-sex marriage are often framed in a discussion of religion. Do you believe life begins at conception? If you do, you're not likely to support abortion. If you're someone who's looking at it from a scientific viewpoint, your attitude's going to be a little different. So your religion or lack thereof can also make a difference. Okay, some of the other factors that come into play with figuring out our political beliefs include the fact that the party leadership has become extremely polarized. The Democratic Party leadership has moved to the left, Republican leadership to the right, and if you're someone who is strongly liberal or strongly conservative, you're going to move with the party leadership. You're going to become more ideologically locked into one position versus another. We also see differences based on income. Poor citizens are concerned with the lack of increase in the minimum wage. The minimum wage hasn't been raised in over a decade. They're also concerned with work safety, environmental protections, housing costs, and so on. Wealthier Americans are concerned about government overregulation of the economy, high taxes, things like that. Now, where we do see an area of agreement is on tax. Tax cuts are pretty popular across income groups. Nobody likes paying taxes, right? If we can get a tax break, we're going to take it. The problem is usually tax breaks do disproportionately help the wealthy, and they do tend to increase the income gap. They don't quite have the effect that's intended. The argument for cutting taxes for the wealthy is called trickle-down economics. It's a belief that was very popular in the 1980s that if you cut taxes for the wealthy, they'll spend the money and that money will filter on down. The problem with this is it's great in theory, but when you cut taxes for the wealthy, they don't usually spend the money, they invest it. So it doesn't actually filter down. If you want to stimulate the economy, you need to cut taxes for the middle and lower class Americans. If everybody in this room got a $5,000 check tomorrow, we'd probably go out and spend it on things we need, right? Maybe a new laptop or for your kids or a new car, right? So we would go out and spend the money because it would be a huge bonus for us. There's also differences between the elderly and the young. The young Americans are concerned with the cost of college education, the environment, legalizing marijuana, things like that. Older Americans are concerned with issues like Social Security, Medicare, protecting their ability to get by now that they're permanently retired. We also tend to see that cities are usually more democratic, partly because of the diversity of the population, whereas more rural areas tend to be a bit more Republican. If you look at a map of Texas in an election, the blue areas are usually areas like Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, Austin. The major cities tend to be kind of the blue pockets within the state, and the more rural areas tend to be red. And there's also the role of the political environment. The Vietnam War and Watergate pretty much ruined trust that people had in the government. When you have a president authorizing an illegal break-in of the Democratic National Committee's headquarters to try and get their election strategy, people aren't going to be trusting the government that much. The American government lied to the people during Vietnam and Watergate, and people stopped trusting the government. We also saw the political map completely flip by the end of the 1960s. The North used to be solidly Republican and the South solidly Democrat. When Johnson, a Democrat, supported civil rights, white Southern Democrats left the party and became Republicans, and minorities became Democrats, so the map flipped. The North became solidly Democrat and the South solidly Republican. And then, of course, post 9/11, the rise of fear, high levels of patriotism, support for the military, things like that also contributed to a change in attitude towards the government. Okay, so how do we decide what our opinion is on something? There's 3 stages to forming a public opinion. The first is what's called the receiving stage. If you don't know anything about a policy, let's say, for example, healthcare, you'll read anything you come across. You'll look through the information. You'll get some knowledge. But then what happens after that is once you've read that information, in the acceptance stage, you then filter out the information that doesn't overlap with your pre-existing beliefs. So if you're someone who thinks the healthcare system is just fine the way it is, you're going to toss out any contradictory information. So you get the information, and then you only accept a portion of it. And then in the sample stage, you take part of that accepted information and form your opinion. So that's when you decide our healthcare system works fine, or we need to majorly change the healthcare system. There's this persistent idea that Americans are uninformed during elections. That's not actually true. It's not that we're uninformed. It's that we're so inundated with information that the information that helped us decide to vote in the first place gets lost. So right now, maybe you're thinking, I'm kind of leaning towards voting for Joe Biden. But then you read something about him that you don't necessarily like. Maybe he says something and you think, I can't agree with that, right? So the freshest information is what you take with you on election day. So you may have decided to vote one way, lose that information, and vote a different way. It's not that we're uninformed. It's that there's so much information being tossed at us that holding on to a decision becomes tricky. There's just so much that gets thrown at us, including completely false information on sides that really doesn't help us make a decision. Where we are seeing some changes is on the issue of abortion. Roughly nowadays, around 60% of Americans believe abortion should be legal in all or most cases. So the majority of Americans believe it should be legal for at least rape, incest, and to save the life of the mother, if nothing else. So that's pretty stable. Most Americans would say there's some circumstances where it should be allowed. On the other hand, same-sex marriage attitudes have significantly changed in less than a decade. Part of it is where once you are exposed to members of the LGBT community, your opinion might change. If you have a good friend or family member who's gay, your attitude might change, right? You might say, well, why can't my aunt marry the woman she loves, right? Why can't my brother get married? This doesn't make any sense to me. So over time, support for same-sex marriage has gone up. And after 2015, when the Supreme Court said it has to be legal all over the U.S., the attitude of most people was, well, it's legal, I'm okay with that. You know, the court's made its decision, I don't really have a problem with it, we'll just leave it alone. Okay. Public opinion is very important for the government because it can help them decide what areas of policy to pursue. The Obama administration wanted to take a look at revising the healthcare system, but they needed to see where we were on the issue. Since 2009, July of 2009, there was a survey done and it said that 65% of Americans would support the government requiring us to have health insurance if the government would help pay for insurance for those who can't afford it. So when the Obama administration saw that it had the support of the American people, they began working on what became the Affordable Care Act. If they hadn't had that support, it's unlikely they would have tried to do that. We can also see opinion shifting because of a new policy. So an example of this is smoking in public. Some of you are probably too young to remember this, but you used to go into a restaurant and they'd ask you if you wanted to sit in the smoking section or the non-smoking section. I'd be walking to class as an undergrad, and I'd have to walk through a cloud of smoke to get into the building of my classrooms, right? Smoking on was legal up through the 1980s. Smoking in bars, restaurants, hotels, cars. So when they started to ban smoking in restaurants, at first there were some people who weren't too thrilled with that. But then when you didn't have to wait for a table in the non-smoking section, or walk through a cloud of smoke, people's attitudes smoking started to change. When you weren't exposed to it all the time, you started to see people, you know what, I don't want smoking on my college campus. I don't want you smoking in front of my kids. I don't want you smoking in the car. So opinion shifted because of policy. When it stopped being common to basically be inhaling secondhand smoke, people stopped tolerating it as much. So sometimes policy shifts opinion and vice versa. The reality, though, unfortunately, is that we do tend to find that representatives are less likely to respond to the opinions of their lower income constituents. Part of that is because of the way we fund elections. You have to raise money as a candidate. constantly. You're constantly running for re-election. You're constantly funding your campaign. So you're going to be more responsive to the people who are funding your campaign than the people who aren't. If we got together as a class and donated $10,000 to Ted Cruz, we'd be guaranteed to get a meeting with him. But if we all wrote him a letter, we'd probably get a thank you for writing, I will get back to you and forward it, whatever, right? We wouldn't get as much of a response. So unfortunately, what this tends to mean is that the policy does tend to reflect the preferences of the wealthiest Americans. Tax cuts, low taxes on corporations, the elimination of what was called the inheritance or the estate tax, where if, let's say, your father was a millionaire and you inherited the estate, you had to pay a tax on that. That's pretty much gone at this point. So we do tend to see that, unfortunately, policy reflects usually the people who are best able to help politicians stay in office. Okay, so how do we measure public opinion? There's over 300 million Americans. We try to survey everyone, we'd never get through the data. So if you're going to do an opinion poll, you have to choose a sample of the population. So if you're doing a national election survey, maybe you try to poll 5 to 10 million Americans. Try to get an idea of where the public is broadly speaking. Try to get enough of a diverse sample that you can accurately measure how we're feeling. And the idea is that all of us at some point should be asked to participate in a poll, right? If we keep asking the same people over and over again, we're not going to get an accurate number. We're not going to get an accurate idea of how this works. So one of the ways they try to find participants is to use a registered voter log. If they want to ask people in Texas how they feel the presidential election is going to go, they're going to look at who's registered to vote and then divide up those names and try to contact those people. Because of course you're much more likely to vote. And if they can see that you're a regular voter, they're going to want to talk to you. And the way they try to keep it truly random is to have the computer generate a list of 10-digit numbers randomly put together, and then just call that number. See if someone answers. But this isn't working as well as it used to. Most people don't have a landline anymore. Most people have their cell phone only. So you have to get people to answer the phone. Quick show of hands, how many of you actually answer your phone if it's an area code you don't recognize? Right, because most of the time they're like, oh, it's probably a junk call, why am I going to answer that? And then even if they do get someone to answer the phone, they still have to get them not to hang up on them when they ask them to do the survey, right? Less than 15% of people who are called actually answer the survey. So first you have to get past the barrier of getting someone to answer their cell phone and not hang up on you or curse you out for calling them. So it's not as effective as it used to be. When people had landlines, it was a lot easier to get people to participate. When I was an undergrad, I actually did participate in a political survey, and my favorite question was, I think, the last one I got asked. And it was obviously geared towards college students because the guy asked me, who would you rather have for a roommate, George W. Bush or John Kerry? And I'm like, in my head, I'm thinking, like, neither, but I guess John Kerry because he studied more. I don't know. Like, how would I pick, right?
I'm curious to find out what category is the family.
Right, they're like, college students say John Kerry would study more, so they're going to vote for no. I have no idea. I also did phone banking for various politicians, including then State Senator Obama when he was running for Senate. And so, I'm sitting there and I'm calling people, and I get this one guy, and we're going through the list of candidates, Republican, 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 Republican. We get to Obama, and he goes, Obama never met a baby he didn't want to kill. Like, okay, clearly not voting for him. But in the state Senate race, he was actually voting for the Democratic candidate because he was pro-life. So, go figure.
I have a question.
Sure.
Right now, since the U.S. Supreme Court Justice passed away, is there a law that says that we have to wait?
Now you've poked the bear. Okay. Constitutionally speaking, what it says is if there's a vacancy on the Supreme Court, the president shall nominate someone and the Senate shall confirm. There's no rule on when. But in 2016, Mitch McConnell and the Republicans, because they had the majority in the Senate, were able to say, we don't want to hold hearings until after the election. There's no precedence for that. But they made the argument that the American people should have a say in it. Well, that was 8 months before the election in 2016. We're less than 2 months away, and now they're trying to argue that it has to be filled as quickly as possible. On the one hand, they're right. If there's a vacancy, it does need to be filled. On the other hand, if you're going to argue that the American people should have a say in this, then why would you hold confirmation hearings why wouldn't you hold them until after the election? So constitutionally, they are well within their rights to fill the seat, but it doesn't make them look particularly good because if you argue that we should have gotten a say in 2016, then you can't really argue that we shouldn't get a say in 2020. So unfortunately, it looks like it's probably going to be filled, but there's no constitutional requirement that says it has to wait until after the election. They're just playing games with it, and that just really ticks me off. It's not supposed to be political. The Supreme Court is not supposed to be political, but it's become that, and it's a freaking nightmare.
So Donald Trump will be counted.
He can nominate someone in the Senate and hold confirmation hearings starting tomorrow if they announce. The Democrats can try, but they would need a couple of their Republican colleagues to help them out because it's a pretty close divide between the two. But I mean, unless the Democrats could find a way to stall it, we very likely will have a new Supreme Court justice before the election. Yeah. That's why it's a mess. I mean, I can see both sides of it. On the one hand, you want that seat filled, especially if it is a contentious election. On the other hand, we're less than 2 months from the election, and it would make sense to have Trump and Biden say, here's who I would nominate, and then let the American people decide, okay, you know what, I'm going to vote for Trump or I'm going to vote for Biden, right? I don't know. I think they're playing games with it because Obama should have been able to fill the seat in 2016. And constitutionally, Trump does have the right to fill the seat right now. But if they're going to play games with it, that just becomes a nightmare. Yeah. Oh, yeah. People were pissed. Because what happened is when Scalia died, the court was sitting at 8, right? If the Supreme Court deadlocks on the decision, it goes back to the lower court. So Scalia died while we were hearing testimony about the DACA recipients. And because the Supreme Court tied 4-4, it got kicked back to the lower court decision, and basically nothing has been settled for them. So you don't want a vacancy on the Supreme Court because you don't want the court to deadlock. So Obama was well within his constitutional rights to appoint a Supreme Court justice, but they played games with it. Nope, they said we're going to wait until Donald Trump becomes president, basically.
And now Donald Trump is like really controversial whether he becomes president or not.
Yeah. Well, and wait.
It is his constitutional right, like you said.
Yeah.
Like, they're not going to be like, there's a debate, but not a Obama.
Correct, yeah. The other thing, too, is Obama did nominate someone that Republicans would have confirmed because he was a moderate, he was well-liked by both sides, and if they hadn't been playing games, he would have easily gotten confirmed. And had Hillary Clinton won, they probably would have rushed the process between the election and inauguration, so she couldn't put a more liberal justice on the court. Yeah. Like I said, it's become political, and it's a nightmare because the court is not supposed to be political, it's supposed to be independent of it, but it's become basically a political tug of war between the two parties, and it's just so wrong. It's just so wrong. And they will be asking people about that for sure. They are definitely asking people how they feel about that. All right, so in terms of what surveys look like, if it is a reputable, and I say this with a little bit of a laugh, if it's a reputable survey, it will have a sampling error of plus or minus about 3%. What this means is statistically there's about a 3% chance that it's not quite accurate. But you need to be careful when you're looking at these. If you look at a survey on CNN or Fox News, it's not going to be accurate. It's going to be well beyond a reasonable sampling error. And of course, they're not looking at people who don't read CNN or Fox News on a regular basis. So some companies have switched to using internet polls, sending out an email or social media blast, participate in our election survey, and you can be entered to win a $50 Amazon gift card, incentivizing it. The problem with this is, of course, it leaves out people who don't have home internet, so people who are poor, the elderly, and so on. So it does remove some groups from being missed and can skew the polls a bit. And it also depends on how they ask the question. If you are conducting a survey, you need to be damn careful how you ask the question because you can unduly influence the response. You cannot ask the question in a way that implies that there's a right and a wrong answer. So they did an experiment with framing where they divided people into two groups and decided to look at affirmative action. So group A was given positive information. It makes up for past discrimination. It levels the playing field, etc., etc. Group B was essentially told it's discrimination, it's special treatment, it's wrong. So then when they surveyed the two groups at the end, Group A had higher levels of support for affirmative action compared to Group B. So you have to be careful how you ask the question. If you say, for example, research shows that Donald Trump is racist, do you agree? That's not an accurate question, right? You're telling them there's a right and a wrong answer. You can't ask it in that way. There can't be a right or a wrong answer, just an answer. So you have to be very careful how you ask the question. Okay, so when we're talking about the margin of error, this is what we're talking about. All right, so here's the sample poll from 2016 in Ohio of a little over 1,100 Ohio voters. Okay, if you don't look at the margin of error, you could incorrectly assume that this means that Hillary Clinton is going to win, right? Plus or minus 2.9 points. This is too close to call. You cannot say definitively that Hillary Clinton is going to win, because that 2% could go either way. She could gain 2%, she could lose 2%. It's too close to call. So if you're looking at something where it's within the margin of error, it's too close to call. You can't definitively say candidate X is going to win. That would be wrong, because you can't statistically say that's going to happen. Now this one, obviously, yeah, you can say the Republican's going to win, right? That's well outside the margin of error. But this one, too close to call. So if you're looking at a poll on the presidential election, look at the source, make sure it's not CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, Breitbart, etc. Look at how they asked the questions, if the questions are included, and look at the margin of error. Right? Make sure it's an accurate, reliable poll before you start getting excited one way or the other. Because in 2016, they got it very, very wrong. Part of it is this confuses people. So you've got to keep in mind the margin of error. If it's within that margin of error, it's too close to call. You cannot say this person will win with certainty. And it's why most news stations will hire statisticians to work for them on election night, to look at exit polls, to look at what's happening statistically, to help them say, we can call this date or we can't call it yet. So there's a lot of statistics that go into elections that people don't necessarily know about. Okay, so part of the problem we had in 2016 was why the polls were inaccurate was because of what's called the social desirability effect. Sometimes when people are surveyed, they give the answer they think an interviewer wants to hear, not what they actually believe. So in 2016, it wasn't necessarily seen as popular to say we're going to vote for Donald Trump. So people lied. They said, oh, I'm not sure, or oh, I'm going to vote for Hillary Clinton, because it was seen as more socially acceptable. If you ask someone about same-sex marriage, if they oppose it, they may feel like, well, I can't actually say that, so I'm just going to say I support it because that's what the interviewer wants to hear. So you do have to be careful with that. You also need to be careful about your sample. You cannot call a survey accurate if a group is over or underrepresented. So a famous example of this is the 1936 presidential election. There was a magazine called Literary Digest that ran its own poll and said, we predict that Alfred Landon, the Republican, is going to win in a landslide over FDR. Funny enough, FDR won all but 2 states, so it was a landslide, just not the way they predicted. So where did they go wrong? Well, first they were surveying people who had cars and telephones in 1936. Who's that going to be? The wealthy. Who are the wealthy voting for? Landon. They didn't do a good enough job of sampling. So since then, for the most part, it's been better. But in 2012, Gallup got into trouble because they didn't include enough Latinos in their sampling. And they were overestimating Latino support for Romney. And so they said, the election's going to be too close to call, and it actually wasn't. So if you're not including enough women, African Americans, the elderly, the poor, Latinos, and so on, you're going to be wrong. And you're going to be in for quite the shock on election night when you're proven exceedingly wrong. During the nominating process, There's also a problem with what they call the bandwagon effect. Sometimes the media and polling will tell people Joe Biden is going to be the nominee. So even if you're planning to vote for, let's say, Pete Buttigieg, well, if the media is saying Joe Biden's going to win, I might as well get on board and support him anyway, right? He's the eventual winner. Why fight it? Why throw away your vote? And it's problematic because there is no set of circumstances under which someone is the inevitable nominee unless they're running unopposed. Right? It was not 100% guaranteed that Joe Biden was going to be the nominee. But the attitude that he was did somewhat influence how people voted. Same thing happened in 2016. Media kept saying Hillary Clinton was going to be the nominee. How did people vote? They voted for Clinton. It's a problem. You got to make sure they're not doing that. And we do see the parties looking at a variety of information, voting history, party registration, social media, purchasing. We've all been on Amazon looking at something, go to another website and see an ad for it, right? There is tracking. There is tracking that's used on websites to look at your purchasing patterns. Are you constantly looking for gun supplies? Are you constantly looking at civil liberties websites? Are you someone who's setting up a registry for a baby, right? The parties are going to be looking at that information and saying, how do we think this person might vote? How do we determine where you are? So unfortunately, because of social media, a lot of our information just isn't private anymore. And a lot of it does end up in the hands of the parties trying to figure out how they're going to vote. So like it or not, it's out there. Which sounds kind of paranoid, but really it's not. Okay. Any questions?
Do you know where, I keep getting like papers in the mail saying that there's early voting, but like it's a junior time or whatever.
I don't know off the top of my head, but yes, there's at least 2 or 3 places in every county that will do local early voting. In 2018, there was actually a polling place in the campus library. I don't know if they're planning to do that again this year or not, but probably, I think early voting starts in a week or 2, so that's when they'll announce where the sites are. But yeah, you can also look it up and say early voting sites, Hidalgo County or whatever, and you should be able to get a list. Yeah, very good question. And it's up to you if you want to take advantage of early voting or not. For some people, it's to their advantage. For geeks like me, we prefer till election day, but everyone has to make their own decision on that.